Welcome to the US Grant Boyhood Home website. We're glad you're here today, or watching today, and the purpose of this video is to give you some history of the US Grant Homestead Association and its predecessor here in Georgetown. There's been some celebration, some more than others, in Georgetown for almost 100 years. And that's the purpose of this event, this video, is to delve into the history of the association and some of the activities. Our mission, our being the US Grant Homestead Association, is a mission to promote and perpetuate the history and the legacy of Ulysses S. Grant. As you probably know, if you're watching the website, Georgetown is the location of the US Grant Homestead, where Ulysses grew up, spent 16 years in Georgetown, longer than he lived anywhere else, and the schoolhouse that he attended for a few years, and also a new statue of Grant that perhaps is one of the finer statues in the country of Ulysses S. Grant. So let's start with this history lesson and talk to Ned for a moment. Ned, tell us some of the impact you think on Georgetown and the surrounding area and our mission that we've had on Georgetown and the surrounding area with our celebrations over these many years.
Well, I think,
and activities for that matter.
I think that our association has done a major change in the appreciation of Ulysses S. Grant in this area, and even far beyond our area through the shows that we have done, through our Grant Day activities, through the home itself and the tours that have been given. And we've traveled to other areas and done events, and I think we have taken a lot of the tarnish that was on General Grant's prestige, and we've wiped that away by giving the positive points about Ulysses and taken away from the problems that were given to him or over the years of the lost cause theory of the Civil War by the at that time in the early 1900s the Southern historians seemed to be in charge of writing the history, and he was the man that was blamed. And so anything they could find, they would blow up. And so none of us are perfect, and of course he certainly was not either, but we have been able, through education and preservation, to bring that luster back to General Grant, which was so richly deserved.
Well, you make a great point, because many people don't know, I think that U.S. Grant was one of the most popular Americans after the Civil War. And of course it led to two terms as president, a very eventual, well-regarded tour around the world. And he was highly regarded, and like you said, his luster kind of fell off, and that's been the purpose of this association.
People don't understand how much he was loved, not just by the North, but by the South after the Civil War, and how respected he was as a man and as a general and as a president in all the states at that time.
Well, certainly we could spend our time in this video talking about General Grant, but actually what we're here to talk about is our own association. I'm going to turn to Nancy to talk a little bit about the early efforts of some organized effort to celebrate US Grant.
Okay, well, it started in, for the centennial birthday celebration of Grant in 1922. And the name of the committee that did this was the Executive Committee, US Grant Memorial Centenary Association. And there were about 15 different men on the committee, and we have the catalog that had it. And here they all are. And one of them up here in the corner is my grandpa. He was one of the ones, Major Freebus was his name. But they started the birthday celebration in 1922. And it was going really well. They had a lot of people visiting the home, the schoolhouse. The home was not in part of this. It was just the schoolhouse, US Grant Schoolhouse. And many, many people started coming because they opened it as a state memorial. It was not part of the state memorial at that point, but they ran it privately in Georgetown. And then they had, you want me to go ahead with the history of it?
Sure.
When, I have to keep my notes here, they started with it in 22, the 100th birthday, and opened it during the summers, and 2 different people were the caretakers and would give tours. They even decided to open it, keep it open until 9 o'clock at night, which I can't imagine, because in the middle of the summer it would be dark, but it was open because they had so many visitors. And I found on one newspaper, this is where all of our information comes from, or news clippings, and one says in 1941 they had over 78,000 people from 1926 to 1941. I mean, that's just unreal. And they did so many other things to build up the road, to beautify the grounds. The DAR did that. They did all kinds of things to make it much more appreciable because they said it would benefit Georgetown, which I'm sure it did, to bring in all those people to visit. They kept a ledger of where everyone was from: New York, California, Anchorage, Alaska. People came, and they said people came from everywhere to see the schoolhouse where Grant went. And they even had to build up the road, State 125. They built it up way more to accommodate all the traffic.
And they called it the US Grant Memorial Highway.
Yes, they did, yes. So coming into Georgetown, it was the US Grant Highway.
Now, we don't know who those curators were.
I've got names of 2,
Oh,
2 of them.
good.
Ella Ashmore and Leo Day. And they were in the 30s, 40s. And the state said to keep them on. They wanted those same 2 people to keep working, so they did. And
Well,
they got paid. They got paid.
I came to Georgetown, well, I was around Georgetown all my life, but I came here to practice law in 1968. And I just barely remember that the schoolhouse was still open with curators at that time. Now, I don't know that it was those 2 folks, but, well, we have the celebration in 1922, which was the 100th celebration of Grant's birth. And this organization was primarily of Claremont County organizations, or persons, right?
Most of them, yes. Yes.
Have you found anything that indicated the organization consisted of any activities here in Georgetown or Brown County from 22 until, say, 72, the next 50 years?
Oh, well, when we had our bicentennial celebrations, what was it, in 69, 68 or 69?
That was
That was
Georgetown and Brown County.
Georgetown's, yeah. Well, we did some there. But it was always open every summer. And I can remember as a child, we'd go over there and play around and roll down the hill. There was always someone there and would give tours. So it was all, I don't think they ever closed it from 26 clear through, except when they did renovations on it, till the 70s. It was just always open and brought in many, many people. But there was this terrible damage, and they did that renovation, started in 1941, to renovate and fix the south side. But then they stopped because of the war. And they couldn't finish it till after the war. I found 2 articles talking about that. But as soon as the war was over, World War II, then they started right back in and finished it again. So it was probably closed 2 or 3 years there during the war. But the rest of the time, as far as I know, it always was open till 1980, 81 or 82.
Yeah.
Then they locked the door and it was shut for 10 years.
Now, you will probably remember more of the details of the 72 celebration, which would have been the 150th anniversary of Grant's birth. But I had been just collaterally involved with the US Grant Association. But in 1972, the members of the organization had formally organized as a not-for-profit corporation, and I suspect it got, in fact, there's a funny story about how that group, in order to celebrate and have some money to celebrate the 72 celebration, Bob Green, and there was Bob Green and Harold Nye, Dr. John McCarley, Edgar Tweddle, John Wayne Cahill, and Fred Hall were all the members of the 72 Corporation, and that's where we got the name US Grant Homestead Association. And the interesting story how they got the initial funds to put on this celebration, Bob Green and probably Fred Hall went around to all the banks in the community and begged the bankers to give them the money that were in their real old accounts, no dormant accounts. And there'd be $100 here, maybe $200 there, but they found all these accounts and raised a substantial amount of money in that manner, and nobody complained, I guess. But that was the way they started the financing for it. But my little recollection of 72, and I was here and participated in everything, and but it was like a 4-day affair. There were home tours, there were speakers, there was a big parade, a lot of children's activities. I remember there was a street dance, possibly that was in '69 for the Georgetown celebration, but the 72 celebration was a big deal. Now, what do you remember about the 72
Well,
celebration?
it's about that it was a huge thing, but it was then kind of coincided with the other celebration that we had just 2-3 years prior to that. But it raised focus on Grant, and we had not done that for many, many years. The schoolhouse was always open, but we didn't make a big deal about anything else.
Do you have a program from the 72
I was
celebration?
trying to find it. I don't think, I'll find it. But anyhow, the focus then would be on the homestead, because that's after George and Tirsa got it. So the home was going to be open for a museum, and that was a big deal, that we finally had the home open. The school had been open for all those years and everybody had seen it, but not the home, and that made a big difference, big difference.
Now, a little more history about the home. You mentioned that the Campbells acquired it probably about, what, 65 or so?
60,
It had been
you know.
a private residence.
65 or 66.
Yeah.
It had been a private residence.
Oh, yeah,
A lot of
rented.
Rented.
Rented house.
Jess Beers, who was a writer in Chicago newspapers, owned it for a while and rented it out.
Rented it.
Fortunately, there was never any real changes in the facility. There never was a like trying to make it into a 2-family or anything like that, and it was pretty well maintained. I suspect that people maybe that rented it recognized that it was a former president's home, and they kind of took care of it. Don't you think, Nancy?
Oh, yes, yes. And back then, people took good care of their home, whether they rented or not. They just took good care of it.
Show us the front of the.
All right, this is the front of it.
Yeah.
This Sesquicentennial program. In
You need to go on, hold it up just a little longer.
72, April of 72. I found the program.
Yeah. Those are
Okay.
those are still around, and we even sell them, I think, at some of our celebrations. But
Yeah.
we've had a pretty big supply of those.
All right, it's school, Wednesday, the 26th of April of that year, all the children from the school went to see the home and the school, which was a big deal. Thursday, the same thing. The Brown County students, Georgetown students went on one day, then all the rest of the schools went on Thursday and Friday. Then on Saturday, there was an art show and a hobby show, open house again, presentation of distinguished guests, a parade starting at 2 o'clock that went down to the fairground, the Miss Ohio pageant at Ripley, and a dance at the Legion that night. Then on Sunday, again, open house.
And this is a picture of the General Grant portrayed either in the 69 or in the 72
Could have been both.
event, or maybe in both, and portrayed on a saddlebred.
And you say that's Roger Crawford?
I believe it's Roger Crawford is what I was told. Yeah.
Roger was a longtime resident of Georgetown, and what did Roger do in private life?
Oh, he ran a dry cleaner.
Oh,
Dry
yes.
cleaners.
Dry cleaners. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Roger was always very helpful in community events, so he portrayed Grant pretty successfully there, I'd say.
One other thing.
A horseback Grant.
Yes. One other thing that started in 72 was the Land of Grant tour.
Oh, yes.
The Land of Grant tour. And it started, or it was at Point Pleasant, in Bethel, as well as Georgetown. Then later on, we just consolidated it to Georgetown, but it started Land of Grant covering all the areas where Grant was. So
And of
that
course,
started in.
Point Pleasant, Ohio, which is in Claremont County, is the place where Grant was born. And we always have to include that after a year and a half in Point Pleasant, the family moved to Georgetown, and there the story of Georgetown and Grant begins. Now, the next few years, the US Grant Homestead Association and that group of trustees that we mentioned, and Jim Hanselman was involved with that, they continued to have a celebration at the Schoolhouse on the fourth weekend of April, which was close to Grant's actual birthday.
At the
which-
homestead.
At the homestead.
Yeah.
And that was,
School
that's
children
April.
always would have part of that,
that's April 27th,
yeah.
right? Okay.
We'd have local bands always play, and children do something to bring in parents. And Judy and lots of others would get together, the ladies, and have a birthday cake. So we had a birthday cake.
It was usually a Sunday event.
Right, Sunday afternoon. That's
And
what it was.
that went on till through 96.
From Saturdays, the
yeah.
Saturday song.
Now, my personal relation with the trustees or the Grant Association was to do some tax work for them, for the organization, and then somewhere along the way, Dr. McCarley asked me if I would be on the board, and of course some members had passed away and we replaced them. I don't know who I replaced, but I became a trustee. And then in 96, one thing we should always remember, or should remember, is Dr. McCarley would have the folks that put on that annual celebration out to their beautiful home out on Bald Point Road. And he'd also invite the
Bagpiper.
bagpipers. He had a group of bagpipers come up from Cincinnati to
Hamilton, I think
participate.
it was the Hamilton County Sheriff's
Yeah.
bagpipe.
And they would always provide a great background music, and they would be out, and we'd celebrate with cookies and drinks and so forth. And Dr. McCarley was a great supporter of Grant. He had a great library, and so at any rate, in 1996, Dr. McCarley retired from being president of the association, and he'd been president for 25 years or so. He was the only president they'd ever had. Dr. McCarley asked me to be the president, and the group said okay, and so I've been president since then. And we've kind of put this story in segments And 96 is important because the next year, 97, was going to be Grant's 175th anniversary of his birthday. And we were approached by a representative of the 59th Ohio Cavalry, not cavalry, but infantry in Claremont County. And they proposed to us that they would have a reenactment here in Georgetown. And they put on a training session, which would result in maybe about 200 reenactors coming with, you know, artillery pieces, tents, the whole 9 yards of a military encampment or Civil War encampment. And after studying that a while, and several of us went to other encampments to just see what activities went on, we decided that we would try that. And in order to go along with that encampment, we decided we could do a program of 3 or 4 days and do a pretty big celebration for Grant's 175th. Well, you'd probably think that not many people would really get excited about a person's 175th, but we did. And we had John Y. Simon was the keynote speaker the first night. He was the executive secretary of the nationally known US Grant Association. He came to Georgetown and gave us a nice talk. We had a large number of sutlers who are merchants that sell items to the soldiers, buttons, shirts, uniforms. They were here, and booksellers, photographer. We scheduled a Civil War ball. We had it down at the Flora Hall, which was really very effective. And we had ladies' tea and a religious ceremony. Talk about the ladies' tea.
Well, it was down at the Grant Fairground, Bryan County Fairgrounds as well, in this big auditorium, Floral Hall. And we had everyone that tried wanted to wear their period costumes, hoop skirts and all. We did that with hats and gloves and served in glass cups our tea and cookies. And then we had a lady give a talk about fashions and that sort of thing. And we had probably 150 women and children and some men as well. And that became a big hit. And so we did that, and we've done that every year since because it has been such a nice thing. And then the ball would be that same evening. And the first year, I don't remember how many we had, but it was a huge number of people came with their children and all, because that's what you did back then. You brought your children to the ball as well as just a husband and wife or boyfriend and girlfriend. Everybody in the family came. So it was a huge success too. So both of them have continued on for many years.
We had one session was about Grant's leadership, which is not generally talked about, but there are some books about his leadership that was sort of a model for corporate leadership today. And then we also had, which has probably been the long-lasting event of the celebration, that was the Budweiser Clydesdales. And Ned has a picture of them there.
In the center ring at the Brown County Fairgrounds with the gazebo in the background. And that was, I think, they were here for what, about a week? Yeah, about a week. And people could come and see the horses, and they would take the horses out and train a little bit. And of course had the Dalmatians with them. And that was a very, very popular thing for everybody to come and see.
Well, we filled the grandstand, and I think it holds about 1,500 people. But they were not difficult to arrange. It was just a matter of writing a long letter about what all would go on at the celebration, and our history of fair parades and the number of people that turned out for it. And the president of the Fair Board, Orville Whalen, and I worked with the Claremont, I believe they're called Claremont Beer Distributing Company. You don't range for the Clydesdales right with the beer, Budweiser company. You go through the local beer distributor, which is what we did. And they provided all the publicity and pictures and everything, and all we had to do was secure some hay and straw and some oats, and which we did, and it was a great event. Regrettably, on Sunday when we were going to have the parade, it poured down rain, and we had to move our whole event that day into the local hog barn. And I remember Dr. McCarley addressing the crowd, and he said this is probably the only grant celebration that's taking place in a hog barn. But it was a nice hog barn. It was a new hog barn, so the Fair Board was glad to show it off. And but that was a great event, and it was basically the beginning. That '72 event was the beginning of the modern era of the US Grant Homestead Association. And we've had an event ever since then, every year. And I'm going to turn to Ned and ask him to describe some of the events we've done over the years with that celebration.
Well, I went to, the first time I was involved at all was I went to the 1990s. We came to the Sunday events pretty religiously, because we were just about a block away. So we were at most of the Sunday events after we came back to Georgetown in 1976. And then in 1997, we went to all of the events of that year, Simon's speech and everything, and the rainy parade and everything in between, the ball. And that was the beginning of us, being involved very much. We both, my wife Susan and I both really enjoyed everything, and I talked to Stan about whether they were going to do this again. And he said yes, they were planning on doing this again. And I said, well, if you are, then I'm going to get a uniform. And so I got a uniform, and the next year I was involved. I just went and stayed with General Grant, Mike Miller, and we have a photograph of Mike here. And I stayed with Mike Miller at his tent around the fairgrounds and talked to the crowd when they came around. And the other gentleman that was with me that day was General Custer, and he came from Michigan and was with us that day, and the three of us talked to the crowd. And the following year I joined the trustees. The events, when we first started at that period, were pretty gigantic. We had them at the fairgrounds. We had hundreds of reenactors. I just found this morning, there's two little pictures that can kind of tell some of the event. This is one of the camps. I think that's the Confederate camp that we had. So you can see that ridge was completely covered with canvas. And this was our Sutlers. That was the main street that we had, and you can see we had 4 or 5 different sutlers and a living history tent, and we had a tent for folks doing knitting and rope making and that type of thing. So those early events were large at the fairgrounds. We had we served meals to all the reenactors. We had a couple hundred reenactors. I think one year we had 14 artillery pieces out there, and another year we had 40 cavalry and had a big cavalry battle. We put grandstands out in the parking lot. That was a nice little rolling area for a battle. We built split rail fences. We built a little house for structure for them to fight around, and we're pretty involved in building a nice place for the battles to occur.
I remember every year you added to something that we had to build.
We built and built and built and built things, and then, and of course, the ball each year got a little more elaborate each year. The ladies' tea, a little more elaborate each year, and always pretty well attended. Of course, we always tried to have a carriage to take people to the ball, so they could park the back of the fairgrounds and get in the carriage and be delivered to the ball, you know, as they would have been, you know, in the 1860s. We decorated the Floral Hall, which was built in the 1880s, so it was a fairly close historical connection there.
It was an ideal facility for all of our activities that we did there.
Yeah, it's a beautiful, beautiful facility still.
We even hung quilts, homemade
Yeah.
quilts.
Near about
All
80,
around the
about
wall.
80 quilts were
Made it
hung
just
around the
beautiful.
walls.
Just beautiful.
Flags were put up in rafters, so it really looked like what would have been, you know. And as Nancy said, all the food was served in glass, cloth napkins. There was no plastic, no styrofoam. Tried to do it as close to the way it would have been as possible, including the recipes for the punches and the cookies, and tried to do everything as
Very
authentically.
One thing I want to interrupt here before we forget an important person that we just mentioned in passing, and that's Mike Miller, portraying all these years, probably for 25 years. Mike portrayed Grant in all of our activities, and the little interesting story about how he became Grant during that 72 celebration. No, I'm sorry. 97 celebration. During the 3 or 4 days, Claremont County Historical Society had an event at the birthplace on, I believe, Saturday afternoon, and a carload of us went to Point Pleasant to participate in their celebration, and Mike was one. And Mike, we were all talking about Grant and different things, and Mike said, you know, I'm the same size, same height and weight as Grant was when he went into the war. And we all agreed and said, yeah, that's right. Well, never thought much about it until a day or two after the celebration, the 72 celebration was over. And I went to Mike. He was manager of the administrator of Georgetown at the time. And I said, Mike, it sounded to me like you might be interested in portraying Grant. And he didn't have to think very much. He said, well, yeah, I would like to do that. So we have a good picture of there. That's Mike Miller as our Grant, and he served as a reenactor of Grant. We've had pictures made up, posters. We have a poster that had the chronology of Grant's life on the back. Great teaching tool. And Mike really became a kind of a celebrity Grant. He traveled around the eastern part of the United States,
Went to lots of schools.
appearing
Lot of
in
schools.
school programs. He was sort of the resident Grant in Buffalo, New York, and so he was a valuable member of our board and a participant in our activities. He later retired, and we have a successor, and we'll talk about him here in a little bit later. Another family that has provided a lot of leadership and participation in our association, and that's John and Judy Ruthven. John was a commercial artist, moved to the area in about 1972, I believe, and at some point the Campbells, Judge and George Campbell and his wife Tirsa, wanted to sell the homestead, and John and Judy Ruffin purchased it and restored it.
Judy's the one that did it.
Yeah,
John
well,
maybe helped pay for
okay,
it, but
well,
Judy's the one.
They were both on our board,
Right.
and
Without Judy, we wouldn't have had the museum like it is today. She's
but they
the one that
restored
did
it, and that basically, Campbell's didn't really have it open all the time, but once it became restored, then John's business took care of providing the guides to the tours. And this was before the Ohio State Historical Connection acquired the homestead, and before we started giving the tours. When I say we, I'm talking about the US Grant Association. But
Close to 30 years.
they
They did it.
they were instrumental. John and Judy were very instrumental. I mean, fundraising, they had connections in Cincinnati that have provided, still provide us with contributions that fund our activities. And John's still involved. Judy passed away, of course, a few years back, but John's moved to Cincinnati, but he still comes up and gets involved with our activities. John did a wonderful calendar of scenes on the battlefield, kind of in the spirit of Homer Winslow, or
That's
was
right.
it
He portrayed-
Winslow Homer, which was
Homer
it?
Winslow.
Homer Winslow.
Yeah.
But he was an actual Civil War artist for Harper's
Weekly.
Weekly.
Mhm.
And John did a wonderful job of portraying that, and probably somebody around still has copies of that calendar.
Copy.
But any rate, now we're I think, Ned, you were about finished with
well,
this.
before
What
we-
about activities outside of our Georgetown here?
Before we move to that, there's another two people I think that ought to be mentioned in our history from in the 1990s and early, or so, would be Mike and Julie Ciccarella.
Yes.
Mike was our longtime treasurer, and Julie was in charge of the ball. And some people might say she was the ball,
She was.
and really got the ball really started, and was a stickler on what was right and what was wrong to have at the ball. And they were very important in the development of that. Our organization, like you can tell, has been very busy with grant days activities, but we've also gone to a lot of other events to try to get the word out about General Grant, promote his history and his legacy. And one of those was we went to Chillicothe as a unit and marched in the Ohio Bicentennial Parade in Chillicothe, and dressed in period costume. And we had, I think, maybe 15 or 16 people in that group. We also went several years to the winter ball at the Ohio Capitol, and that was held in the right in the Capitol building,
Atrium.
in the atrium, and we went up and went there several years and were part of that great grand ball. And then on the reunion of Abraham Lincoln traveling to Washington to be inaugurated, he stopped in Columbus and gave a speech. And on that anniversary, the National Park System had Fritz Klein, who we knew very well, portray Lincoln and go into the chamber of the House of Representatives in Ohio and didn't recreate his whole speech, because I think Lincoln's speech was over 2 hours long, but he recreated part of his speech, and we were selected as the color guard. And so we went up to Columbus, and Fritz didn't know we were coming. And when he saw us, he was quite shocked that we were there. And we marched in with colors and stayed and then walked out with him as a color guard to protect him. So that was another pretty memorable thing that we did that made the papers. We also did a lot of things locally. West Union had a program where they celebrated I think their sesquicentennial, and we went up to West Union as a unit, and the campsite was at the Wilson Children's Home, and we participated in that, talked to a lot of folks about General Grant. We each year go to Decatur, where the statue of the 70th Ohio is, and we're the color guard for that parade. We've gone several years to Mason, to their History Day, and spread the word there. And then as an organization, we have also had some big events with characters brought in. We one year had a dinner with Abraham Lincoln and brought Fritz Klein in to the Methodist Church Hall, and people came in, and most of the people came in dress, or at least dressed up. It was a White House reception, and we had a dinner of period fare, and Fritz Klein came as Abraham Lincoln, and we had music and singers, and had a whole evening of it. And then I think a year later, or maybe 2 years later, we had, where's that program? That program's here. Oh, here. Here we have where we did a White House grand reception with Abraham Lincoln. And this was our program we handed out that had sample recipes and stories about Mr. Lincoln. And then the following year, was that true? Yes, the following year we had a grand riverboat reception, and that was done in Ripley. And the guest star that year was Mark Twain. And so he came to the reception and told some stories. And
he arrived on a riverboat.
He arrived on the riverboat, had a small reception on the riverboat, and then we had the dinner in John Rankin's Presbyterian Church and had the skits that went on. So those were two of our very popular things that we did. But we've done a lot of these things for out in the public. One of them being, one year we did a Memorial Day across the river, and I think that'll show up very well, a Memorial Day across the river for a grave marker that was replaced that had been missing for, they thought, probably 80 years, of a Civil War soldier in the cemetery there outside of Orangeburg, and took our bugler with us. And I always thought that was a nice photograph of our bugler standing kind of in the mist, playing for the Memorial Day service, playing taps. But those are the types of things that we have done over the years, as far as, you know, going to other organizations and doing those type of kind of outsourcing our knowledge to people.
We can't do this without talking a little bit about Morgan's Raid.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead and tell us about that. You were uniquely involved in the Morgan's Raid.
So when I first came into the organization, and they started to talk about next year's event, everybody had a job. And I didn't have a job, because I was the new guy. And so they started to talk about what they wanted to add. And one of the things they wanted to add was a walking tour. And they wanted a narrated walking tour. And I waited and nobody said anything. And finally I said, well, everybody else has got a job. I guess I can do that. But I didn't grow up here. You know, I grew up about 12 or 13 miles from here. And so I, wasn't intimately knowledgeable about Georgetown and the people who lived here. At that time I was working 70 hours a week as a large animal veterinarian, and I said, well, I could probably do that, but I don't have any information. And Nancy said, well, Jane and I put together a little walking tour. We'll give you that. And so the first year, that's what I had, was that information and what little bit I looked up. And of course I mostly talked about this homestead, and then we went to the schoolhouse and we went to the courthouse and went through. Then over the past years it increased, got bigger and bigger, and I found more and more information because each year I had to tell different stories. And so we had gone probably 10 years into it, and I had a couple ideas of what I could do to liven it up. And the one year I had the church bells ring at the time that the news came from Shiloh of the victory. So I got them to time the Presbyterian Church to play Battle Hymn of the Republic at the right time. And of course the timing was a little late, but it worked out. We got that done. And the next year I decided that at that time we had cavalry coming to the big battle. And it was quite a deal. We had 30 or 40 cavalrymen there. And so I asked a couple of guys I knew the best if they would come over, and when I was on the courthouse square, if I would set it up by telling my crowd that there were reports of Morgan's Raiders here in town, which of course were here actually, July 15th, 63. And I said, there's reports of them being in town. And as we turned the corner, I was to take my hat off, and 4 raiders rode 1 block, shooting their pistols, chasing my brother-in-law, who was dressed in a Union cavalry uniform, down the street. And I fired 6 shots with my pistol, and that was the first raid. And before the walk was over, Stan and I were walking along in between stops, and before that walk was over, the raid was born. And so the next year, as part of the event, I can't at this point believe we actually were doing this, but we had the raid and the big battle the same year. We had 2 big battles, one on Saturday, one on Sunday, and the raid on Friday, or on Saturday, originally was afternoon. And then, so we did that for 8 years. And we had as many as 35 cavalrymen. We had 50 unmounted cavalry. Probably had 60 townspeople involved that were dressed. We had bankers, we had telegraph men, we had kids playing games in the street,
Well, about that time, if I can jump in here, Lester Horowitz published his book called The Longest Raid. And of course a lot of us read it, and we picked out different things that actually happened along the raid and portrayed those on the square. We got rid of all the cars. There was a no parking zone. All of our local participants were in costume, and we put together a script which was loosely followed, and it lasted probably 40 minutes or so. We started with a wedding, which the raiders interrupted, But it was historical, but it was also entertaining. And we put 800 people up on the square and to watch this. And
This is a little photo of part of it. This was the local militia lined up to stop the raiders when they came into town, which didn't work out real well. We took off at the first shot. But that was part of Les's book about the militia folding. And then this is a couple of the more famous raiders that we had. Dave Bowles in the floppy hat, and he'd bring his rooster with him and steal the rooster and steal loaves of bread.
you know, I'm sorry, Bowles, he was the one that really said, you folks have got the ideal location to put on a raid. There were other places that were trying to do it, but he said, you've got the ideal location to put on a raid. And we just followed up with his advice and took off with it. And
You know,
people have asked us, are you gonna do the raid? I mean, years after we quit doing it, they keep asking us about it. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
we had, like I said, we have a lot of local participants that were involved in it and were interested in doing it each year. And the local businesses would let us put signs in the windows to cover up their signs so that we had it. You know, we some of the raids I went to in other places, you know, were just on Main Street and the cars were still parked there, you know, and so, you know, we covered the mailboxes, we covered the parking meters, you know, so we tried to make it as authentic as we could. And to have even 15 horses, but in the first couple of years we had 35, just on the street in one block, people thought there was 100 horses, you know, so firing their pistols and spinning the horses around, and then of course we would take the horses to a side street and we would watch them, and most everything else was done on foot till the end. But you know, it was quite of an event that was done.
Well, one thing I've got to say, the wedding, every year it was a real wedding. They really got married, and several were so anxious because we were asking early in the year who would want to have a wedding up on the square, real wedding. And we'd have a minister and it was going to be a real wedding, but it wouldn't cost them anything. Oh, well, that's more
We didn't
appealing.
have any trouble finding participants.
No, and they just had to rent a costume. But then we'd have the crowd, you've got a crowd of 500 people, we're gonna give you a cake, and you're gonna have all your pictures. All you have to do is wear your costume and show up. And it worked for 8 years. We had 7. One was a recreation of their wedding, prior wedding.
Yeah.
But
And-
they bring them up in a carriage, it couldn't have been nicer.
And of course, that was based on one of the actual events in the raid that Horowitz wrote about. That the raiders showed up while there was an outside wedding going on, and they took all the food and went on. So we kind of based it on a lot of those various things.
Yeah, and the raiders had to wait until the wedding was over to make sure they got married first. But it wouldn't interrupt the wedding itself.
One year we expanded the raid. I think it was 2000. I'll have to look later. We expanded the raid and we had the raiders start about 10 miles from Georgetown. And they camped overnight in Hamersville. And the next morning they got up and they rode, and this is a picture of them riding along one of the country roads. I would think if you were sitting out there on your front porch and saw them riding by, you'd wonder what the heck was going on. But we rode to a farm in about halfway to Georgetown, and then we had a school day. And we had a cavalry battle, and we had about 300 school kids come by bus. Can't do that today, can't get buses to go, but we got them there and had that event. And the only problem that year was that night we had tornado warnings, and torrential rains all day. And the following day, we had to have the raid in our Gaslight Theater. And so it was an indoor raid. And there's a shot of our indoor raid. And one of our famous characters from the indoor raid, Aunt Betsy, portrayed by Judge Margaret Clark. And she welded a rolling pin. And when the Confederates were taking down the American flag and replacing it with a Confederate flag at the courthouse, she would go and take the American flag from them, protect it until they were gone. And so that was always a highlight of the parade, or of the raid. A lot of different things people enjoyed from the raid.
We better talk some about the saga of the statue.
Yes.
We had a lady here in town, Susan Bean, called me and pointed out about a sale up in near Newark, Ohio, that some fellow was selling sandstone statues, historical figures, at a park. Actually, it was in Frazeysburg. And there was a Grant statue, a part of these historical statues, and it was an online auction. Turned out it actually was an on-site auction, but they were taking bids online, and she said the only bid that's been made on the Grant statue is a $2 bid. Well, I got to looking at it. We had this park that Ned mentioned earlier, and so I went up and took pictures of the statue and upside down, inside out, the whole 9 yards to bring them back. And we went to the town council, Georgetown Council, and proposed that the Grant Association and the town would buy this statue and remove it, bring it down to Georgetown and put it in this little park up by the courthouse. And they approved that, and we had a budget of about $8,000, and we're really excited. We talked to somebody that would build a base for it, and
Talk to a mover that would move
talked
it
to
for
somebody
free.
that would move it, got estimates, we had a budget. I wasn't, it looked generally like Grant, but it wasn't right on, but it was close enough, and for what we thought nobody's gonna buy that but somebody from Georgetown. So we had to go visit my daughter out in California on the day of the bidding. So I'm gonna turn the day of the bidding over to Ned, and he was there, and Bud and some of the
Yeah,
others.
four of us went up. Bud and Joy White, our treasurer and secretary, and my wife, who's a trustee member, and myself. We drove up to the park, and and we also had we met the village administrator when we got there, and the five of us walked around first. We got there early enough we could walk around, and I think there was somewhere around a dozen statues there. That the gentleman that had started this park was a funeral director.
Right.
And he built this park as a picnic grounds and an area place where people could come during the funerals. And he was an amateur sculptor, and he did these sculptures. And
That was his son was the
his
sculptor.
son was a sculptor, and he did Washington, and he did most of the Ohio presidents, and a doughboy, World War I doughboy, and he did Sherman, but Sherman didn't have a head.
Didn't have a head.
And so there were several of these statues there, and there was a crowd, but not gigantic. And when the time went over and got our bidding number, and like you said, we had about an $8,000 budget, and hoped to get it much cheaper than that. And we looked around the crowd, and it was kind of a motley crew. It didn't look like any big spenders there. And when the call for the bidding was going to start, they started at General Grant. And No, I guess they had one before it, yeah.
It was bid on any,
Yeah, you bid on, we went to the grant statue, and then you bid. And then you could choose, once you won the bid, you could either choose one statue, or you could choose to buy all statues for that, each individual price. So if you bought 10 of them, and you bid $100, you had to pay $1,000. So the bidding came up, and they started the bidding, and we're all standing there, and we're pretty happy about this. We're looking around, and yeah, we're going to be okay. And the bid was to, as I remember, after it was very slow. Nobody was bidding, and there was some guy leaving, and he started up the hill through the woods, and he looked over his shoulder and he said $500, and went on. And he took this $500 bid, and 3 bids later, it was at $13,000. And so we failed to even make a bid. We never even got a bid in. So we came home, and everybody was a little dejected, but then again, like Stan said, it wasn't the greatest statue. So we thought we would come home, and we talked about it. And then Stan you made the deals with...
Well, after about 6 months, the village council, the mayor, came to me and said, we really like the idea of almost getting a statue. Can we get back into that, see if we can find somebody to do one? And I said, well, certainly. And the same deal applied, half and half, yeah. So we talked to Jim Hessler, the proprietor of Georgetown Monuments, local rock seller. And he found somebody that had a connection with a sculptor in China. Well, that had some political ramifications to it, but we said, okay, the price was right, and we took a bunch of pictures of different statues and shipped them down to the people. I think they were in South Carolina, and they in turn sent them to the Chinese sculptor, and this went on for months and months, and we'd get a sample of what they've done so far, and we'd write back, and we made corrections, or what we thought should be corrections. And this went on for over a year and a half maybe, and finally we got a clay model of what the statue was going to look like, and it, honest to goodness, it looked like a garden gnome. And we rejected it and started looking elsewhere. I think we lost a couple of $1,000s in the deal, but it just was not satisfactory. Well, Jim looked again, Jim Hessler talked again to a company in Vermont known as the Vermont Monument Company, and they said, yeah, they can do it, and gave us a pretty good price. And the only way they could do it at that price was when they didn't have anything else to do, they would put their sculptor to work on this statue. And so again, it went quite a long time, perhaps over a year, before we got to the point where it was done. And even that sculptor quit the Vermont Monument Company with it 90% finished. They got somebody else to finish it off, and we got word that and while that was going on, we were preparing the site and the base of it and all, and we sold I think 3 benches, maybe 2 benches for people to sit around the site. And we put bricks in the plaza, sold bricks in the plaza.
I think about 400
yeah,
bricks.
we pretty well financed our part of it with these bricks. But we heard that it was ready, and bring it on, bring it on. Well, we hadn't seen any picture of it at all, so it was, God, is it going to be another garden gnome, or is it going to look like Grant? Well, they brought it in, and sure enough, sat it on the pedestal and took the wrapping off of it, and we were just thrilled to death with the statue. And it's well lit at night, and it's a beautiful statue. We, like I said earlier on, I think we've been considered, this statue's been considered as one of the best in the country of Grant, and there are several members of several of them. And so that's another contribution our association has made, and the town, of course, too. We had a very, I thought, effective dedication ceremony. We invited several, 20 or so guests that were here. That some of them participated, some didn't. I think they all appreciated the opportunity to be here. We get a lot of comments about the statue, and it's worked out very successful, and we treat it as one of the Grant sites here in Georgetown, along with the Schoolhouse and the Grant Homestead and the statue and a great portrait that's in the local library. And so those are things we've done and we continue to do. Might mention, I've got some books there on the table. We've had well-known authors come to Georgetown to research Grant, talk to Nancy here about the facilities and the sites. Ron Chernow, a recent author of Grant, and Ron White have both been here, and they've written very successful books about Grant. There's been others.
Joe Crone.
Joe Crone, yeah.
He's coming back again this year.
Right.
He's going to come back and speak.
So let's talk about our more current celebrations and some of the things we do.
Before we get away from the statue, you know, we had a large crowd on a very, very hot August day, and but the statue process actually began back in 1999 with the village getting the piece of property, and then about 2001, the village manager at that time, Ray Beecraft, came up with the idea of a Grant statue on that property, and his was going to be equestrian, and that was cost prohibitive. So then the story then goes on to us, but during that period of time, Mike Miller, our General Grant, was hired at the Ohio Veterans Home, Southern Branch. And while he was there, of course, portraying General Grant, he got involved with, he always wanted a statue, and it didn't look like it was going to happen at the courthouse. And so he got involved with statue at the Veterans Home, just on the edge of town, and posed for it. And the Vietnam vets, it was a single person, a single group, paid to have a bronze statue made and out at the Veterans Home, leaving Georgetown there's only two cities or two villages in the United States that have two statues of US Grant, and that's Washington, D.C. and Georgetown. So, part of our involvement with getting a statue, Mike carried that along with him and got that second statue done. So I think that's also something interesting to go. Yeah, our events have kind of morphed from one thing to the other. We went from the fairgrounds and very large reenactor groups. Then we kind of centered around the raid down in Georgetown itself on the streets. And during that period of time, we started having a bigger living history event at the homestead. And now that we don't do the raid, we have a very impressive living history event at our events every year that includes Kurt Fields. Dr. Kurt Fields is our current General Grant, and he is the General Grant of the National Park System and also is here several times a year at our events. And, you know, he has kind of a funny story too, because he's a member of the Sons of the Confederacy, lives in Memphis, but is very dedicated to General Grant's legacy, and so does an excellent job for us. He and his wife Lena, who portrays Julia. Our Living History event has added a magician, period magician, that's very popular. We have a retired librarian that comes each year and does a program right before the ladies' tea, and that's been very popular. Some of our members present at the event, and then out in the fields we have a marble display, and we have photographs of General Grant. We have a food display. We have artillery pieces. We have a small group of reenactors. Last year we had a medical tent. So we've kind of pulled things closer together right around the homestead, so that the homestead gets most of the attention, you know, which is what our original idea about having Grant Days was. And,
Well, something we haven't mentioned, and we want to be sure to mention, the Historic Society took it over in 2002, and they wanted to restore and do some reconstruction and changing things. So they did, but it wasn't until 2011 when they did it. But they did research and so forth between those two periods, 9 years, of figuring out what they were going to do. So when they did it, they replaced the wallpaper, the carpeting and drapes inside, and a lot of other things. Then outside they did a lot of reconstruction and so forth, so we had decent parking and handicapped access and all that. But when it was all said and done, we found out they spent 1.4 million, and that just kind of blew our minds.
took the white paint off.
Yes, 1.4 million was spent on that, and part of the really good part was the animatron that is Grant. He's 15, and he sits there and talks and tells stories about growing up in Georgetown. And that is one of the biggest hits for all the kids and adults as well. When we give tours, everyone is just amazed at this animatron because he's so lifelike, and he talks and tells stories, and it's really worth seeing.
Well, the mention here about the future of our organization, we continue to add folks to our board of trustees. We meet every month and planning on different activities, and I'm reasonably sure the celebration will continue. Again, it's on the 4th weekend of April, or close to that. And but the Waters family recently donated the tannery to the Ohio History Connection. This is about 2 years ago, they're developing a plan for the tannery that will enhance, again, the history and promote US Grant. We haven't had any direct contribution in that other than a couple of meetings, but we think in the next year or two, and certainly by the 200th anniversary of Grant's birth in 2022, the tannery will be restored and have some purpose connected with US Grant, and we'll be over there planning and guiding tourists to the tannery and explaining it.
One way or the other.
One way or the other.
Yes.
And I think there's some interest in promoting Thomas Hamer, who appointed Grant to West Point and was a resident, of course, here, U.S. Congressman, appointed Grant to West Point, served in the Mexican War where he passed away, but according to Grant, he may well have been another president of the United States had he not passed away or died in the Mexican War. But I don't know, are we about finished with this video?
I think that
Okay.
tells a pretty good
Well,
history.
we hope that this has been informative to you folks. It's a lot of information. Boy, I'm surprised that we've included all this information, and there was no script for this, folks. We just went on. I think it would have been as well as if we'd had a script, but we didn't cover everything, but we've had the benefit of a lot of publicity over the years, and folks here locally have helped us, and we hope you'll come and enjoy Georgetown and our various grant sites, and come to our celebration on the 4th weekend of April, or close to it, depending on which weekend that is. So, and we haven't, of course, we haven't mentioned that we've sponsored Ed Bars
Yeah.
each year for the last 10 or 12 years.
Yeah, I think this will be his 11th year.
And he is the historian for the National Park Service, or retired historian. And he is a very honored individual among Civil War enthusiasts. We have people come from Cleveland, Dayton, Cincinnati, St. Louis to hear him speak, and we are quite honored that he comes here to Georgetown, and he likes the way he's received here, and we're going to have him come as long as he wants to. But at any rate, we're glad you took time to watch our video, and we hope you've learned something about our organization. We also have a newsletter and membership. So thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.